Special thanks to Horizon Therapeutics for sponsoring the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast, working tirelessly to research, develop, and bring forward medicines for people living with rare and rheumatic diseases. Discover more about Horizon Therapeutics' mission at horizontherapeutics.com.
And we got lucky. Somebody from my company called and said, look, I understand that Jake was born with Williams syndrome. I happen to have a friend who has a daughter who's about 4 years old named Kimmy. She wasn't but maybe an hour away from us. And we were able to go down there and meet Kimmy, who was just a ball of energy and one of the most pleasant little 4-year-olds you'll ever meet in your life. And we got back in the car with a big collective sigh of relief. Okay, A, we know what cocktail personality now means. And B, if Jake is anything like that, there is some blue sky ahead. There really is. And that was so helpful, so helpful.
That's our guest this week, Ron Janowczyk, a wine industry veteran and owner of Special Strong, a sports facility for folks with special needs. Ron has 3 kids, including Jake, 26, who has Williams syndrome. We'll hear about Ron's years in the wine industry and about his new venture providing a place for people with special needs to work out. That's all on this week's Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast. Say hello now to our host, David Hirsch.
Hi, and thanks for listening to the Dad to Dad podcast, Fathers Mentoring Fathers of Children with Special Needs, presented by the Special Fathers Network.
The Special Fathers Network is a dad-to-dad mentoring program for fathers raising children with special needs. Through our personalized matching process, new fathers with special needs children connect with mentor fathers in a similar situation. It's a great way for dads to support dads. To find out more, go to 21stcenturydads.org.
And if you're a dad looking for help or would like to offer help, we'd be honored to have you join our closed Facebook group. Please go to facebook.com/groups and search Dad to Dad.
And now let's hear this conversation between host David Hirsch and guest Ron Janowczyk.
I'm thrilled to be talking today with Ron Janowczyk of Colleyville, Texas, the father of 3, a wine industry veteran and owner of Special Strong of Northeast Tarrant County, a sports facility that helps develop specialized fitness programs for people with mental, cognitive, and physical challenges. Ron, thank you for taking the time to do a Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast interview.
David, thank you for having me very much. I'm honored.
You and your wife, Gloria, have been married for 39 years and the proud parents of 3 children, Lauren, 35, Joe, 33, and Jake, 26, who has Williams syndrome. Let's start with some background. Where did you grow up? Tell me something about your family.
Sure. I grew up, I was born and raised in South Bend, Indiana. I am smack in the middle of 5. I'm the oldest son. I do have a younger brother now. Who's 12 years younger than I am. We didn't travel much. There was one time that we moved, I think at the end of the 3rd grade to Cincinnati, Ohio. And then we moved back. And that's where I went to middle school and high school, and then on to the University of Notre Dame.
So lots of South Bend in your background.
Yes, my wife's father coached linebackers at the University of Notre Dame for 26 seasons, I believe. So yes, I'm pretty tied to Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana.
That's awesome. So out of curiosity, what did your dad do for a living?
My dad was an electrician. Yeah, that's how I learned to use tools and go on jobs with him. He was a man of a lot of grit. That's how he made a living.
Where do you think that grit came from?
Probably his father. My grandpa, Janowczyk, worked at the same factory for 44 years. I believe it was called Simplicity Pattern up in Niles, Michigan. They bought these patterns and they were like paper thin, but you stacked them thousands at a time and you cut them out with a bandsaw. And that's what my grandfather did. And then when he wasn't doing that, he would be a cabinet maker for people, not only in his own home, but for his friends. So again, a lot of tools there. So very self-made, hardworking kind of guy. And that was passed down to my father.
I have the envision of like a workbench with lots of tools. Like you're prepared for every occasion.
There were 2 things he had a lot of: tools that he passed down to my dad, and pipes. Another thing you don't see very much, but my grandfather probably had 30 pipes. I think we found 30 pipes, and I still miss that pipe smell as a young kid going into the house.
That's awesome. So how would you describe your relationship with your dad?
Loving. I mean, I was his first and oldest son. Spent a great deal of time with me, whether it was fishing or later hunting, teaching me how to play baseball, going to as many of my games as he possibly could. He led me along, told me how to respect women and get along with my three sisters and the things in life that were important. So,
yeah, well, it sounds like he was a role model dad.
Tough, though. Tough. Frequently, nothing was good enough, right? Dad, I got a B+ on this. Why wasn't it an A-? Dad, I got an A-. Well, why wasn't it an A? And then why wasn't it an A+? He definitely drove me pretty hard.
Do you think it was his military background?
I think so. He used terms like, hey, get that squared away. Things that you would learn in the Marine Corps all the time. Sure, I think that was part of it. That was his way of putting some discipline and structure to what I did and how I thought.
So any important takeaways, lesson learned or two that come to mind when you think about your dad?
Yeah, my dad was a pretty generous guy. I can remember sitting at restaurants with my father where my dad would get the bill. And later I learned my mom was looking over at the tip that he was going to leave. And it didn't matter where we were. My dad always was considered a big tipper. That's what I heard my mom call him. And I asked him about that one time in the car, and he said, these people are also trying to make a living, and they've got kids like you at home. And just because they don't have a toolbox like me doesn't mean that they're not doing a good job. And so I simply I sort of honor them with what I leave them. And I have never forgotten that. Now, I think that would give you a glimpse into my father's generosity and respect for somebody who's just working hard.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. It's really important insight. You'd mentioned that you went to University of Notre Dame. My recollection was you took degrees in philosophy and marketing, and then you headed out to California, and you were in the wine industry for almost 4 decades.
I was. It's the only business that I know up until today. I was just glad to have, made it through Notre Dame. My ability to get in was either the grace of God or an administrative error. I still to this day believe that I was a lead balloon on the average SAT, that my manila folder was stuck below that, someone else's that was approved, and that's how I got in. All kidding aside, I was not gifted with really, really great intellect, so I worked really hard. Spent a lot of time in the library. But look, I do not regret any of it. Notre Dame was a great experience. Really great experience. So I was lucky enough to be recruited. Ernest and Julio's sons, Joe and David, both went to Notre Dame. So I was recruited by Gallo, went to Southern California, and I stayed with that organization for the better part of 8 years, and then moved on, worked for 2 other companies, and had a very blessed career, was around a couple of very large transactions that benefited our family. And so in November of 19, after a little over 38 years in the wine business, I was able to retire.
That's fabulous. So if you had to share something about the wine business with our listeners, since you probably have more experience than virtually every one of the other 500 plus mentor fathers, what would it be?
Oh boy, be a equal opportunity drinker. It doesn't matter whether it's pink, white, or red. You might have your preference, but drink them all. And then I would always tell people, especially today, there are almost no flawed wines. I mean, from a technical aspect, all wine is really good. That wines are simply they're not better than one another. Don't get hung up in that. They're just different.
Yeah, so I think what comes to mind is that everybody's taste is a little bit different, right? What might taste good to you might not taste good to me. So it's a matter of your palate, right? And finding things that you enjoy.
You bet. Exactly.
Excellent. Well, thanks for sharing. Let's talk about special needs first on a personal level and then beyond. And I'm sort of curious to know, prior to Jake's diagnosis, did you or Gloria have any exposure to the special needs community?
We did not. No, on either side, there was no family members or any, not even close friends that I can think of that had any challenges of any kind.
So, what is Jake's diagnosis, and how did that diagnosis come about?
Jake was probably about 8 weeks old, and he clearly wasn't eating or keeping things down, wasn't sort of chunking up like our other kids had. And we ended up taking him to a doctor who then directed us to University of California, San Francisco, UCSF. He was, after about a day, he was seen by a few doctors and then given this label of failure to thrive, which is sort of that general catch-all for, we don't know what to tell you yet. And so there was an army of people that came in and out of that room and looked at Jake. And finally, one day, a woman walked in with a long white coat on and turned him over and looked really closely at his face and said, "I think I know what's wrong with your child." Not exactly a word you want to hear, but nonetheless, this was the first doctor that said something with a little certainty. She said, "But I'm going to need the permission to grow some of his cells in the lab for 72 hours. So sure enough, she comes back and with the test results and shows us these fluorescent markers on his 7th chromosome that showed a clear black gap in one pair of those chromosomes, and then explained to us that was the confirming test for Jake having been born with Williams syndrome. That's about all she said. She handed us a black and white piece of paper that was probably just something she had copied off of a Google page somewhere and left. And nurses came in shortly after that and said, "You'll be able to be discharged later today." That's how we started with Jake.
Sounds very abrupt.
Yes.
Sounds very abrupt. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the first you learned about Williams syndrome. And my recollection was that this was early on, 25 years ago, when genetic testing was just really starting to sort of become more popular.
Yes, I believe after having met with folks at the Williams Syndrome Association that we were so lucky because that was the first year that there was a confirming test for Williams syndrome. That up until that point, they thought that there were many people in the population walking around that had either been misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. Mm-hmm. Today, it's still fairly rare. Williams syndrome, the population of Williams syndrome in America today is roughly 30 to 32,000 people.
Is that nationally or is that internationally?
Nationally.
Okay. 30 to 32,000 in the U.S. Okay. Mm-hmm. That sounds like a large number, but relative to the total population, obviously very small.
Very small.
If it was being misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed, what would it be similar to or confused with without the genetic testing? Do you have any sense?
You know, a lot of people pointed out that there are very similar facial features among kids with Williams syndrome, not unlike Down syndrome. They didn't have a great deal of coordination or could easily gain weight as a result of that. Some of them with eyesight and thicker glasses. Those are things that we thought, wow, well, I think we know some folks with Down syndrome who fall under that same. So, but it is clearly not. There's a deletion on this chromosome. There's not an extra chromosome. And so there was really nothing that we had to compare it to. It was a black hole for a while there.
So thinking back to the days, weeks after you got the diagnosis, what were some of the fears that you and Gloria had at the time?
Oh, I think they're probably common for anyone with a diagnosis, and that's just this great unknown. What will my child become? What hardships might they have? For that first couple of days, guilt. You know, this world is hard enough. What did we do to cause this child to be born that would make his journey through life even more difficult? We had since found out that it is a completely random genetic event. It had nothing to do with us, but that lingered for a while. It really did. I'm just being honest about it. That was hard on us.
Yeah, well, thanks for being transparent and authentic about that. I'm wondering, was there any meaningful advice that you got early on that helped sort of put things in perspective or help give you sort of a renewed focus?
If you looked at the information they first gave us, and then we obviously did more of our own research, one of the things that stood out to us that was like, I don't know what this is going to look like, but this is cool. They were described as having cocktail-like personalities. Really? Later we found out what that was. I mean, Jake used to be called the mayor of Windsor where we lived. I mean, there isn't anybody he doesn't know or who doesn't know him. So that sort of high social interaction was what they meant by that Jake could walk in a room anywhere and he'd be talking to them. And we thought, aside everything else, intellectually, cognitively, that's something we look forward to. I really want to see another child to see what that translates to. And we got lucky. Somebody from my company called and said, look, I understand that Jake was born with Williams syndrome. I happen to have a friend who has a daughter who's about 4 years old named Kimmy. She wasn't but maybe an hour away from us. And sure enough, we called them, the Gaines family, and we were able to go down there and meet Kimmy, who was just a ball of energy and one of the most pleasant little 4-year-olds you'll ever meet in your life. And we got back in the car with a big collective sigh of relief. Okay, A, we know what cocktail personality now means. And B, if Jake is anything like that, there is some blue sky ahead. There really is. And that was so helpful for us.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing. I think that experiences like that remind me that there's angels out in the universe, right? People that you meet. Maybe it's the person at work that made the introduction. Maybe it was the Gaines family that you got to know early on that, helped take some of the edge off or give you a sneak peek of maybe what to expect, right?
You bet. Absolutely, there are.
So were there some important decisions that you made as parents, raising not just one child, but 3 children?
Yeah, the family aspect is interesting because our other kids weren't exactly, young adults yet. And they went through some of the same things we did. What's that going to mean for us? And how are we going to have to help? And, how's he going to live? I mean, simple questions. Is he going to be able to feed himself? Can he dress himself? Are we going to do that for them? And again, probably like a lot of families, it just drew us closer. Jake became the nucleus of the family. And boy, the things that my kids must have learned, perhaps all of us learned, things like just gratitude, perspective and patience and expectation and not to judge. Those things are just really important life skills that everybody gets, but you get them in spades when you have a member of your household that has some challenges.
I wanted you to share the story about Cardinal Newman, because you mentioned that Joe went there, and that was very, I think, pivotal. At least that's what I remembered from a prior conversation.
It is. So our son, Joe, Jake's older brother, went to a private Catholic school in Santa Rosa, California called Cardinal Newman. And Jake went to all the games. He wore the shirts and the sweatshirts, and he was just Mr. Little Cardinal Newman. And so when it came time for Jake to go to high school, we looked at each other like, okay, well, what do we do now? I mean, they don't have any program at all for kids with special needs. He was going to end up having to go to the public school in our town. And then we stopped to think about it a minute. And boy, this would be, if I could pass anything on to young dads considering something, it wouldn't be to set limits. It would be to go into a situation like, okay, here's where he'd like to go to high school, but here are all the obstacles. Stop to consider, what would it look like if Jake could go to that school? Under what circumstance or condition might this work? And that's what my wife and I talked a great deal about. Until then, I contacted the school, asked to see the folks in the admissions office, and went in there and sort of made our presentation. Here's Jake, our son Joe. Here's what Williams syndrome is. Here's how we think he learns best, how he wouldn't learn best. And at the end, I merely said, if you are the compassionate, caring Catholic institution you claim to be, you will look really hard at my kid. And look, being a sales guy, yes, that's kind of a mean-spirited close, but I meant every word. I just wanted him to get that chance. And 6 weeks later, the college or the high school football coach shows up, who knew my son Joe obviously really well, with an envelope, and handed it to us, and we opened it up, and it was Jake's admission letter. And then, of course, the work started. But he is the first student they've ever taken aboard that had any special needs at all.
Yeah, well, I love that story. He's a pioneer of sorts. And what I sort of heard in your pitch or your presentation to the admissions committee was laying on a little layer of Catholic guilt.
Oh, well said. It really was.
Yeah. And, it works, right? I mean, we do that as parents raising our kids, and, why wouldn't you use it in another context, right? And I admire your vision and Gloria's vision for what can be, right? Because you have to have some faith, honestly, to put your child in an environment where they're not really set up like the public schools would be set up, right? There's some unknowns and some uncertainty, and no doubt it wasn't a straight line. Everything didn't work out perfectly. Some people were more accepting and inclusive than others, but you figure it out, right, as you go along. And I'm hoping that just by virtue of what you just described, others listening to your story might also be able to draft on the experience that you just described. And no doubt, it wasn't one and done, right? Jake was not the only person that went to this school, went to Cardinal Newman with special needs. I'm sure that his experience there, your family's experience, gave some confidence to other families in your community to do the same thing.
I sure hope so, because I would say this. One of the things I said to that admissions group is, I am absolutely convinced that Jake is going to have an effect on somebody's life here. I'm not sure how, but I guarantee you he will have an effect on somebody's life. And of course, in the back of our minds, we're thinking a little bit of what's the flip side of that. This is a very sort of privileged, college-bound, some would say sheltered group of kids. Is he going to be picked on, And I would tell you the exact opposite happened. There was always somebody classes above him that took him under his wing and made sure that Jake got what Jake needed. It was just an experience that we weren't quite expecting. Kids coming over to the house to spend time with him, things like that.
Oh, wow. Teachers
willing to meet with us and accommodate him and how he learned and how he could get through the material and take the tests and do things like that. Yeah, just a tremendous experience. I was thrilled. And of course, you're crying like you're cutting onions, but they did a presentation for Jake. They have, it's California, right? So the kids eat in a lunchroom outside. There is an area now that has a big wall on it, and it is called Jake's Place.
Very powerful. I don't want to focus on the negative, but to be real about it, I'm wondering what have been some of the biggest challenges, and I'm wondering very specifically if there was any resistance by other parents who might not have been as open-minded as others about having a child with special needs in the classroom, sort of draining, if you will, some of the resources away from their kids or, being a distraction of any type.
It's a very interesting question, David. We were told, look, you guys are not going to want to hear this, but it's not just education. It could be in just society at large, that there are a group of people, let's just call it 5%, who almost resent a child with special needs in the class. I'm not being paid to make accommodations for his lessons. And oh, by the way, your son is in constant motion. He rocks, and that's annoying to me. Well, okay. I guess if you know that, sort of going in, you take an offensive approach to that. You say, how might we sort of clear the way or ameliorate some of those issues? And so one of the first things after he was accepted that was work for us that we said was so important is asking for a meeting of who his freshman teachers would be. We knew and were told that they met every summer, as a group to get together, and they say, different teaching plans and things like that. And they did. They granted us 30 minutes with his freshman teachers where we came in and we described who Jake was and shared with him all that we had learned about the education of a Williams syndrome child and how they learn best and what some of the things that may come up. We also assured them that there would be a part-time aide that we found who could assist Jake in a couple of his classes, not all, but some, that could be somebody that they could communicate to almost daily to bring back information to us about Jake. But we came up with that. Especially in a school that doesn't have a program, don't think that they're going to come to you out of the goodness of their heart and say, this is what you guys really should think about doing. You really have to be offensive-minded approach for that. And as everybody talks about, you got to advocate for your child. You really do. It's just something that you have to take an active interest in doing. And I think they appreciated that. Is every year that he was there, it became easier and easier and easier.
And post high school, I'm wondering what, if any, educational experience has Jake had?
Jake didn't. As a matter of fact, interestingly, that Jake didn't have an interest in going on to school, nor does he even today at 26 have an interest in living outside of this house. And we have looked at all of the options, including living with someone else. We have met a whole bunch of people in this community here in Texas that would make great, housemates for him. And should we buy a house for him? Should we hire a full-time caretaker for that house? And he just, for reasons we don't understand, doesn't have an interest in it. So until he does, Jake will be part of this household.
That's fabulous.
He's been working 8 years at a place called Market Street here in Colleyville, a grocery store. Now, imagine you got a cocktail personality and your job is to bag groceries and take them to the car. So every 10 minutes you meet another human being and you get to spend time with them. I can't think of a better job for Jake than that.
Yeah, well, it sounds like he's perfectly suited for that.
He really is.
And, that's where you are today. That might not be the situation a year or years down the road. So things evolve, right? Things change.
Yeah.
We'll be back with more of the conversation on the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast in just a few moments. But first, this quick message. Please help 21st century dads gather research on families raising children with special needs by having them complete the Special Fathers Network Early Intervention Parents Survey. A link to the survey can be found in the show notes. As a token of our appreciation, each person, mom or dad, who completes the survey will receive a Great Dad coin. Thank you. Now, back to the conversation.
So I'm thinking about other organizations, and the one that you mentioned was an employer, Market Street. What other organizations have played an important role for Jake or for your family for that matter?
Very early on, the Williams Syndrome Association. It's based out of Detroit, but a really fine organization. They hold a national convention every year. And for us, going there, even without Jake with us when he was still an infant, was probably the most impactful. And there's so many different courses spread out throughout the day, taught by both parents and educators and specialists in each area. If you're worried about what he eats or doesn't eat, you can go do that. If you want to see he likes music so much because I think 15% of the population of Williams kids have this unique ability, almost savant-like. They can't read music, but they hear it, and they can sit at an instrument and play it perfectly or sing in perfect tune. I think 60 Minutes actually did a piece on Williams syndrome in that regard one time, Morley Safer. But we've given him every opportunity to do that. And he although he loves music, loves going to concerts, there's no music. He hasn't created it in any way so far. But
so Williams Syndrome Association, any others?
Sure. Special Olympics. The minute we saw that there's a continuum of most challenges for kids, whether they be physical or mental, Jake seemed to be at the high end of that spectrum. From early on, he could jump in a pool and, at 4 years old, swim like a harbor seal. And that was something we noticed right away. He got on a skateboard or a scooter really fast. He could throw and catch a ball early on, and that hand-eye coordination wasn't something that we were expecting. And so as soon as we could, we got him into Special Olympics, and he competes to this day in 3 or 4 different sports. Jake has a hole-in-one.
Oh.
Jake had a hole-in-one on a 147-yard par 3 while playing with his brother. And still to this day, I don't know that he understands just the importance of that event. Like, he doesn't tell everybody about it. I said, why wouldn't you tell anybody about that, Jake? I've been playing golf a long time, 30, 40 years. I don't have a hole-in-one. So there's things like that. I can't beat him in a game of horse. He can throw it up from the half court and make a lot of half court shots. So Jake's athletic ability and sort of his fitness level, there was no question in our mind that contributed to his group of friends and kids in school sort of gravitating towards him. And even when he was a little shaver, I remember that he would play with a ball at recess. And I remember the teacher coming to us and saying, he plays with all the kids in these games, no problem. And if he's playing by himself and he loses his ball and it goes on the other side, the other kids go run it down and say, no, that's Jake's ball. And they bring it back to him. Even early on, he was having that sort of effect on people just because he was such a great kid with a little bit of athleticism. So,
yeah.
So Special Olympics, huge, and I believe it's going to remain big in his life for many years to come, and I certainly hope so. There's a couple of other places here since moving to Texas that he's involved with Club Metro, which is more of a social thing. And there's a community here called South Lake, and they have something called the Miracle League of South Lake. The Texas Rangers came in, wrote a check, and built baseball fields exclusively for kids with special needs. Just a fantastic organization, and so he's been involved in that. Yeah, when he's not working, and he works a lot, he is always busy, constantly busy.
So he makes a living working at the food store. Does he have things that he saves for, or that he spends money on, or does he have a understanding of the concept of money?
No, he does not. And anyway, it's sort of funny. It's almost a running joke. He'll get his check, and he'll open it and say he didn't work much. And like one time he said, Dad, I just opened this. It's $87. Is that a lot of money? I said, well, geez, Jake, if you don't have any, that sure is a lot of money. And then he says to me, does that mean I have bank? I just cracked up. Yeah, Jake doesn't spend a lot of his money, but he went and saw his brother in California, flew for the first time by himself. He bought his ticket. He loves music, so he's always wants to buy concert tickets. And he was gifted enough to go to WrestleMania this year at Texas Stadium. He's a big wrestling fan. And so, buying his T-shirts and things like that. And I certainly always get a kick out of it when he says, Dad, I want to take you to lunch. And he offers to buy me a beer. 26-year-old Williams syndrome, Jake. Okay, Jake, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I love it. Thanks for sharing. So let's switch gears and talk about Special Strong. My understanding is that there's 8 locations, 7 there in Texas and 1 in Phoenix. And I'm wondering, How did you learn about it, and why did you become an owner?
Sure. Well, as I told you before, I was lucky enough to have retired back in 2019, and like a lot of people, I just sat down and started working on the bucket list with my wife. What is it you want to do? And let's get a place at the lake so we could take our grandkids there, and let's make some trips back out to California and see Joe, whatever those things were. And then one Sunday, we're sitting at a church service, and prior to the church service, they're showing different videos of upcoming events, and up pops this vignette on a young man named Daniel Stein, and the problems and educational obstacles that he had, and how his parents introduced him to a weight set and fitness, and how that helped him deal with some of his issues. And then back in 2016, he and his wife decided, we're going to start a company, because he had already been a personal trainer. We're going to start this company devoted to the fitness for people with special needs. And then he franchised it. So we watched this video, and my wife looks at me and I look at her, and it was just one of those kind of looks like, well, that was interesting. And we get in the car and we talked about it a little bit, but that was it. So a couple of weeks pass, and I go to a business leaders conference. They showed the video again. Now they could have shown videos from anywhere, and they show this video again about a local guy from McKinney, Texas, who started this business called Special Strong. And I will tell you, it was never clear to me. I got in the car at that point and I said, okay, Lord, I am not the brightest bulb out here, but I know you're pounding me over the head with this one. This is something you clearly want me to do. I get it. In hindsight, I think he, like a lot of things, God just laughed about it. He said, yeah, you had this really nice, almost 40-year career. I gifted you with all those blessings, but really, you just built your toolbox, because now this is what I want you to do. And so we talked about it. And one of the toughest pitches I made, you could appreciate this, was having to go back and sit with my wife and look at her and say, honey, by the way, can I get you a glass of wine? Maybe a bottle. What would you think about us unretiring? What? And of course, I think she thought, I was being recruited to come back into the wine business. I said, no, absolutely not. Remember that video that we saw? Let's talk about that a little bit. Could we own and operate that franchise? I got plenty of gas in my tank. We've been blessed with the resources to be able to do it. And I said, let's really stop and take a look at why we think Jake has done as well as he has. Isn't a part of it his coordination? Isn't a part of it his fitness? He wasn't born with all those things. He developed them over time by just playing with other kids. Don't we want that? If it's possible, can't we get that for somebody else? And if so, let's do it. Let's give it a shot. And I will tell you, I still feel strongly. I never talked much about things like a calling. I actually feel drawn to this. I feel like I am merely being obedient. This is what I want you to do, Ron. You are my hands and my feet to help this community of underserved people. That's what I needed to do. And I'm just snapping off my salute saying, absolutely, put me in, coach. So that's how we started the business.
Wow.
Yeah.
So give our listeners a sense. How many square feet, what type of services or exercise fitness programs are available currently, just to put things in perspective?
So we bring them into that social environment. And I will tell you, because I've seen it with my own eyes, that the neurotypical people inside that gym come to know the people that we are working with. They will finally introduce themselves. They will come over, high five someone, fist pump them, call them by name. And I will tell you, for many of them, it's the first time in their lives that someone has actually spoken to them in that way. We believe strongly between mind and body connection. And you see that firing right away when they step inside that gym. So the kinds of things we do are adaptive. They're highly specialized to whatever challenge they have. And so there are There are people with Down syndrome. There are people with cerebral palsy. There are neurotypical people that are either amputees or MS that come in and say, geez, my insurance won't pay for physical therapy anymore, but I know this is helping me. Can you guys help? And we build and we do program design based on that individual and that individual's goals and some of their obstacles. But we also do in-home training. So we could definitely work with the youngers in-home or even the elderly in an elder fitness situation.
I love it. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking about advice now, and I'm wondering if there's any advice beyond perhaps the scope of our conversation, advice that you can offer a dad who might be closer to the beginning of his journey raising a child with special needs, or somebody who is inspired by the story, the Special Strong story, and wants to be more focused on athletics.
Sure. I think I mentioned one earlier, and I think this probably transcends athletics. It goes to anything. Your child, despite what you may see today, is going to change somebody's life, and probably in a pretty impactful way. I would also say, learn from your kid. I can't tell you how many times we have felt 2 inches tall because Jake has no prejudices. Jake does not see age. He doesn't see gender. He doesn't see race. If you're Jake's friend, you're Jake's friend. And I see that in a lot of kids with special needs. They simply lack the prejudices that we do. And it's refreshing to see. So I would pass that on to people. Learn from your child.
Yeah, well, if I can paraphrase, don't set any limits. Be aware that your child's going to make a difference, maybe a profound difference in someone else's life, if not other people's lives. And then learn from your kids, right? Have a heightened level of awareness. So is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
My faith is much stronger as a result of Jake. I think my wife would say the same thing. I think looking back, we were 36. I was, rising in my career. Positive things were happening. And here comes Jake. And to look back at it now, I just think about it differently. And I say, you know what it was? I honestly believe God wanted my wife and my kids and us just to be closer to him. And so he blessed us with Jake.
Very powerful.
Lastly, I don't know if I like what I would have become had Jake not come around. I think I am a better husband, a better dad, a better friend, brother, boss, neighbor, all because of 26 years with Jake.
Yeah, well, what I heard you say, and not in so many words, but very similar to what I've heard other dads say, which is, I wouldn't have asked for a child with special needs. But looking back on it, knowing everything you know today, I wouldn't change anything.
Nothing.
Very profound. Thank you, Ron.
You're welcome.
So let's give a special shout out to our mutual friend, Daniel Stein of Special Strong, for helping connect us.
Yes. Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it very much.
If somebody wants to learn more about Special Strong or contact you, what's the best way to do that?
Absolutely. I am Ron.Janowczyk at specialstrong.com. So that is JAN as in Nancy, OW, C as in cat, Z as in zebra, YK. Ron.Janowczyk at specialstrong.com.
Excellent. We'll be sure to include that in the show notes so it makes it as easy as possible for somebody to follow up.
And they don't have to pronounce it.
Ron, thank you for your time and many insights. As a reminder, Ron is just one of the dads who's part of the Special Fathers Network, a mentoring program for fathers raising a child with special needs. If you'd like to be a mentor father or are seeking advice from a mentor father with a similar situation to your own, please go to 21stcenturydads.org. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. As you probably know, the 21st Century Dads Foundation is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, which means we need your help to keep our content free to all concerned. Would you please consider making a tax-deductible contribution? I would really appreciate your support. Ron, thanks again.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast. The Special Fathers Network is a dad-to-dad mentoring program for fathers raising children with special needs. Through our personalized matching process, new fathers with special needs children match up with mentor fathers in a similar situation. It's a great way for dads to support other dads. To find out more, go to 21stcenturydads.org.
And if you're a dad looking for help or would like to offer help, we would be honored to have you join our closed Facebook group. Please go to facebook.com/groups and search Dad to Dad. Lastly, we're always looking to share interesting stories. If you'd like to share your story or know of a compelling story, please send an email to david@21stcenturydads.org.
The Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcast was produced by me, Tom Couch. Thanks again to Horizon Therapeutics, who believe that science and compassion must work together to transform lives. That's why they work tirelessly to research, develop, and bring forward medicines for people living with rare and rheumatic diseases. Discover more about Horizon Therapeutics at horizontherapeutics.com.